Today, we're going to talk about mid-side processing. So, often when I bring up this subject with the reverse engineer students, sometimes they end up complexifying it and confusing themselves. So, I really wanted to make this video to kind of demystify that process. Now, we're not going to go into the crazy science of mid-side, but what I want to do is make this video to introduce these basic concepts so you can kind of start to understand how mid and side work together, and we can start to utilize some of the cool processing tools like mid-side functionality in saturation plugins, EQ plugins, compressors, all that great stuff, right? Because I find you can't really utilize those tools to their fullest capability unless you kind of have this basic understanding of what mid and side is. Now, again, we're not going to go into the crazy complex details of this, but I'm going to explain it to you in a way that makes it a little bit easier to kind of understand, right? So, one of the easiest ways to first start off understanding this concept is just understanding what the mid and the side channels are, right? So, when we come into the DAW here, if I was to then open a meter, and I think this is one of the easiest ways to kind of show this. So, if I was to open a meter here, and let's just open it here on this full stereo mix, right? We don't have any audio kind of running through, and that's just because I don't want you to get distracted by the audio that's playing. I kind of just want you to visualize what's happening here with these channels. So here in this meter here, we have obviously a left channel and a right channel, and that will kind of make up our stereo difference there, right? So when we play audio through this, right, especially through a stereo mix, we're going to have usually equal parts energy, right? So we're seeing this peak level being really close to this peak level, right? Little fluctuations here, but for the most part, they're pretty close, right? Now, a lot of students get very mixed up when we start talking about mid and side because they're like, okay, well, does that mean it's what's panned left and right? And I would say to an extent that's correct, right? But things can live in the mid and the side channel simultaneously. And it's almost like we have a sliding percentage scale of where things lie in the stereo space, right? So when we're looking at this, right, we have a left and a right channel again. So what happens when we pan something left and right? So let's take this track and let's pan it, let's say 50% right. What tends to happen with students is they believe that now that we've panned something and we've moved it in the stereo space, that now it is all occupying in the sides, right? That is partially true, but what the thing is you have to think about what's happening here. So when we pan something 50% right and left, and let's play that audio there, and let's just mark off these on the meter. Well, we have a higher degree of the signal being on the right side, right? So we have the audio now that we've panned it left, or I'm sorry, now that we've panned it right, we're seeing that audio kind of accumulate on the right side. But now we have a lesser signal on the left, but we still have audio on the left, right? So what the side channel is the difference between these. Meaning when I play these, right, we can kind of just cut here, and this difference is what is actually in the side channel, right? Everything here, because again, we have the same audio that's being run left and right on these sides, right? This is going to be the mid channel. This is going to be the sides, right? So, like I said, it can be on a sliding scale here. If we move this even wider out, now we have an even greater distance between those discrepancies in the right and the left channel. So, all of this information is going to be side, and all of this information is going to be mid, right? So it's a little bit easier to start to understand what the mid and the side actually is. So just know the greater that we pan something out left and right, like let's pan it out 100%, Now that is all difference. So if we go 100% right or left, now all of that information is in the side because we don't have anything on the left that is setting it in a stereo space. It's all positioned on the right or the left side. So that's the only exception, right? When we have 100%, we only have audio coming from one side of the channel, and that's going to make that 100% side information. Like I said, as we pull it in, we get this sliding scale back where instead of now 100% of that being in the side, this is in the side channel and this is in the mid channel. So that's really, really nice to know as you start to pan things in your stereo stage, right? As you are either producing or mixing your elements and you are moving them in the pan space, you are kind of setting them whether they're going to be in the mid channel more or the side channel more or 100% in the side channel. And that's if you do 100% left and right. And you'll often see that in stuff like, for instance, guitars, right? In rock music, a lot of the time they'll pan elements really far out wide, like the guitars, right? They'll pan one guitar left, one guitar right, 100%, right? Sometimes other genres obviously will do that as well, but it's really prevalent in that type of music to see that kind of spread as far as the stereo image goes. Now that's all great, right? We starting to understand, the mids and the sides. But now that we've started to kind of understand this, and I'm gonna reset this here. And now that we start to kind of understand this, now it kind of gets complex the more that we get into like actual stereo files, right? So for instance, here we have a stereo master, right? So with this track is made up of tons of mixing decisions up to this point, right? As far as where we've placed stuff in the stereo image, spatial processing plugins, um, anything that's really contributing to that stereo image or that sense of space in the track. So why mid-side tools kind of exist isn't necessarily to go crazy with them and to be super destructive with them, but they're to be able to target specific parts of our audio that we normally couldn't touch with our regular tools. Now, what I want to do here is I want to open up an EQ just to kind of talk about this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull the master. I'm going to set that back at 0 so we can hear the audio. This one too dank, this one too raw. Verse in the bank and I lay down two more. Random breathe, the shot, meet your big space. Waking a light in the club, face to me. So we have a track here. I'm going to open my EQ. And so what we can do, and what's really nice about this Kirchhoff EQ, a lot of different EQs also do this, but we can kind of solo the mids and the sides, right? So if we solo the sides, we're only going to hear that difference, right? And we're also going to hear a lot of the spatial processing. So we'll likely hear some reverbs. We'll likely hear things that are panned very far out wide, left and right for the whole spectrum. So from 0 hertz, even though we can't really hear 0 hertz, but from the lowest spectrum all the way to the highest spectrum, we're only going to hear the side information. So we hear a lot of that width that was created in the mix, right? We hear a lot of the reverb, spatial processing, things that have been moved out wide. We hear some echoes, some delays. We hear like the high end of the mid range of the bass. Now let's listen to the mid channel. This one too dank, this one too raw. Verse in the bank and I lay down two more. Random breathe, the shot, meet your big space. Waking a light in the club, face the main place. Someone take me to a doctor now. Flew so high then I dropped the ground. So we hear a lot of the things that are pretty much primarily centered, right? We'll hear more of those elements prominently, right? The things that are dead center. But even like I was saying, on that sliding scale percentage, we're going to hear things that are also positioned closer to that middle center signal. So we hear the bass, for instance, the kick, the snare, the vocal. All of those things are coming straight up the middle. So those are very, very prominent in the mix, right? So this becomes a very, very handy tool when we're talking about things like mastering or we're working on something like a mix bus, right? Because this with mid-side processing, we can kind of get that last little bit of shaping to happen with the stereo image. Now, I want to warn you about using these tools to kind of just manipulate your sound like Play-Doh, especially with EQ, because EQ, the way EQ works is much like noise canceling headphones, right? So when we cut here, the way that we're actually achieving this volume difference is that we're creating some phase inversion happening there. So it's canceling out effectively these frequencies, right? So we want to be extremely careful when we use stuff like mid-side processing, especially with EQ, because we can do a lot of damage to our track. So again, as you start to understand some of these things, it'll be a little bit easier to discern, am I doing too much, right? But generally, we can start looking at some of these frequencies in terms of stereo image now, right? We have with the EQ the ability to start looking at, especially on a stereo track, the frequency spectrum from 10 hertz to 20 hertz right here on this EQ. But now we can start thinking in terms of space in the stereo image. So that's where things get interesting with mid-side. We can target things that are in the middle of the spectrum, meaning the stereo image and the sides, right? Because things in the sides, and let me just, cut this away. But things that are in the middle of the image and the sides of the image can have the same frequency content inside of them, right? Meaning now that even though we have them panned in space, they may still clash with each other frequency wise, right? And this can create a lot of mud, especially if you're talking about lower frequencies, occupying kind of that same space. You get a lot of masking happening. So the beauty about mid-side is that we get that finite control in something like a stereo master or final mix, where, for instance, maybe I'm hearing some issues in the guitars that are in the sides of the channel. Well, with a regular stereo EQ, if I hear some mud in the guitars, well, I can't effectively make this cut without affecting everything that shares and occupies that frequency, whether it's in the sides or in the middle, right? So we really, really want to start to be able to understand that so we can use different tools. So here, obviously, I have a left and right stereo band here, meaning we're affecting both the left and the right channels equally with this band. So if you hear me cut what I'm cutting here, so let's actually start this back at 0 gain. Let's solo this. So we're kind of hearing everything in that zone. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut this zone. We hear a thinness in the vocal, a little bit of a reduction in the mud as well in the bass, which, right, that's a good thing. We want reduction in the mud and the bass, but we don't want to maybe target the vocal. We also get a reduction in maybe some of the spatial processing that's in this zone, right? So some of the reverbs and stuff that's building up in the zone is actually getting pulled out. But we're also targeting, like I said, that vocal and everything that's in that center channel, which is not always what we want, especially in a mastering scenario. So what we can do now is instead we can make something like a side cut. And again, we can just test this out to see what's the difference, right? So when we solo this, let's listen to actually what's in this frequency space, right? Well, now we don't hear the vocal. We hear the reverb. We hear a little bit of that bass. We hear some of that upper bass. We hear some of the percussion. And we hear a lot of the like delays and stuff that are also baked in. Now, if I was to switch this to a mid band, let's hear what we we can hear now that we have this soloed.
This one too dank, this one too raw. Verse in the bank and I lay down two more. Random breathe, the shot, meet your big space. Wigging a light and a clock, face the main.
We hear more of the fundamental of the bass. We hear now the kick and the snare. We hear the vocal. So again, if we switch this back to sides, now when we make our cut here, right? And I'm just exaggerating this to kind of give you a demonstration here. But now if we make our cut here, we're only going to be targeting that mud, right? The buildups of those reverbs, some of the stuff that's not actually adding any tonal quality here. It's adding spatial quality, but it's also something that may be interfering or interacting with the actual mid channel in a negative way. So if we want to get some clarity out of our track, sometimes we can cut from the sides to make more space for the mids and vice versa, right? I'm not saying that you always want to cut sides, but I'm saying frequently that will be something that you can kind of look to do, because obviously a lot of the times, let's say when we're mixing or we're producing, there could be times where you are maybe not being as efficient as possible when you're setting up your spatial processing. For instance, reverbs, delays. You might be sending a lot of low frequencies, a lot of the stuff that's in this zone, you might be feeding that into your reverbs, which causes so much mud in this zone because a lot of the fundamentals actually sit in this range, right? In the low mids, that's where most, elements really sit and occupy. If we kind of look at the piano range here, in this sweet spot in the low mids, right? This is where like C3 is. So middle C and a lot of the, instrumentation that we put into our productions, C4, C5, but mainly C4 and C3 kind of live in this zone. So we can get a lot of stacking of masking happening here. So especially now if we're feeding those into reverb. So now not only do we have a mid signal or, a percentage, a sliding scale, but anytime we add a reverb or a delay, that's kind of actually contributing to the sides, right? It's creating kind of more of a wider stereo image. So, side bands will allow us to make cuts here and kind of get rid of that mud. As you see, when I actually boost this up, we kind of get even more of an exaggerated stereo image, right? It sounds a little bit more muddy. This one too dank, this one too raw. Verse in the bank and I lay down two more. Random breathe, the shot, meet your big space. Wigging a light and a clock, face the main place. Someone take me to a doctor now. Flew so high that I dropped the ground. Again, these are for demonstration purposes. I'm not telling you to cut so drastically or boost so drastically, but again, this is just so you can hear the difference here, right? So now that's affecting just that side image in this frequency zone. So effectively, right, if we have things that are panned dead center, and then we have things that are left and right, out of these left and right, we are cutting this 300 zone. We're not touching what's in the middle. So that's really, really efficient in something like a master where we don't have control over all of the stems, right? So mid-side processing is actually a really cool tool to be able to target things very precisely. Now, let's talk about the mid-channel. Now, let's say I wanted to boost that mid-channel now, right? Maybe I wanted some more body in the vocal, or I wanted some more body in the bass, right? In this area, maybe I just wanted to increase it in general, but every time I try to use a stereo band, it was getting muddy. Well, that again was because of our side content. Now, if I cut that side content, I can actually come in with a mid band and I can actually boost that without increasing some of that intelligibility with the mud that was happening in the side channel, for instance. So I'm creating a greater contrast between what we have in our side image and what we have in our mid image by boosting the mids and cutting the sides. This will be something that you'll see as a really wide technique that's used when you're doing spatial processing with EQ, mid-side processing, sorry. But just know that this kind of opens up your world to many different ways that you can start going about effectively carving out space in your stereo image. Now, again, this is a tool to find problems or create enhancement opportunities based off of that stereo image. It's not something to go in and just start, having 50 different bands here doing crazy stuff, because that's when you can really start messing up your stereo image. You can really start to get a lower fidelity quality of your sound, because again, EQ is all about phase inversion, right? So the more nodes that we have and the more that we're actually doing these crazy shifts and these crazy moves, right, that becomes problems down the line. So obviously the spatial processing and the spatial kind of arrangement as far as soundstage is way better to be handled in the production or the mixing phases rather than trying to do the heavy lifting here. But know that with a stereo file, like a final mix, or a master, right? These come in handy to kind of make those small tweaks or those small adjustments in a situation where we wouldn't have that level of control, right? So that's just explaining in a stereo kind of setting here with this file. Now, if we come to this here, right? Let's come to this sound, and this is just like a harp loop that I have here. But I chose this one because it's like very stereo, right? So let's listen to the sides. Cool. Let's listen to the mid channel. And that creates like a really nice stereo kind of experience here when we listen to this harp. Now, again, with something like this, we can start using mid-side to kind of shape that, because again, this is a stereo recording, right? I didn't add any processing to this file, right? It's not a mono file. It is a stereo file. So it was recorded with this kind of idea in mind of creating this stereo field. Now, again, mid-side comes in so clutch to be able to start shaping this a little bit to fit inside of our mix. Now, again, we only have this individual element, so we don't have complete context here, but I just want to show you the power of being able to kind of shape these sounds with this. So often, again, what I like to do is I like to make sure that I have clarity in this zone here. So low mids and obviously the lows. I don't like personally to have a lot of lows being fed into my sides. This goes far deeper than just what you hear often of like, phase coherence and making sure that things translate to mono more efficiently. That is so true, especially when you're working with basses and sub basses. But there's exceptions to the rule. Often I don't like the way this sounds in particular because it has this layer of mud. And when I like to hear low end in a sound, I like to have I like to be able to tell clarity, right? So here, I always like to make sure I check and create a little bit more of a contrast between the sides and the mids, especially if there's a lot of side information in these ultra lows. So again, I try to create some contrast here and some contrast here, because I find that these are the zones that often get muddy and they contribute to this lower fidelity, lower focus sound. As I start to make smaller cuts in these areas, we start to kind of center the image in a way that creates this very nice gestalt that kind of leads to this taper efficiently, where our lower frequencies, if this for instance was mono and this up here was stereo, on our frequency spectrum we're creating something like that, right? Where as we go up the spectrum, we're getting more stereo width. And I've just found that, again, to each their own, but in my experience, this has created so much more of a contrast in your sounds, a more clear stereo image, and more clarity in the low end. And that sometimes just is worth its weight in gold. So again, that's why I'm saying often I'll look in these zones, but it's not to say, oh, this is a hard, fast rule that you do every time. So again, let's listen to this band. I'm going to make it a little bit wider here. So in our sides, usually in this low mid area, a lot of this will get taken up by the sides if we're using spatial processing techniques or miking techniques. So I'm just going to pull this down a little bit, especially if I was trying to fit this in the mix. It's a little bit different when you're working with individual sounds, but if I'm trying to fit this with other sounds in context, I want to probably cut this a little bit, but we can kind of see the difference. I suggest using some really good headphones or stereo monitoring to be able to hear this difference here. But when we pull this band down, even a couple dB, right? We don't even have to be that aggressive. But when we pull this band down, we immediately get this sense of centering, right? Because we're creating this complete difference between the mid and the side channel. Often, what I'll do too is I don't use high pass as much with the side stuff just because high pass could introduce its own issues. But I tend to use low shelves inside mode, and I kind of tamp some of this down as well, right? So we can kind of listen to what's in these zones. Right? A lot of that is just like air, right? It's not really anything that's contributing to the tonal quality of the sound. There's no notes really there. It just sounds like room. So what I like to do is just cut that out. Sometimes I might use a dynamic band to kind of squash that, but here in this case, I'm just going to kind of lower that a little bit. Let's listen to the mid channel. In the mid channel, I might want to actually make a cut here in this, pre 1K area, just to create, again, a little bit more difference between the mid and the sides. So on that one note, I was hearing in my right ear, which means it's a lot more stereo, right? I'm hearing an issue, like kind of like a resonant there frequency there. Let's play it again. Right there, right? So I heard that little resonance there, and that's coming more from the sides, right? So here maybe I can come in and fix that by targeting just the side image here. Let's solo this. And we can kind of just fix that resonant issue that's only taking place in the sides, not so much in the mid. Now, I probably would want to, attack some of this in the mid channel again, because normally if you have problems in the sides, especially in a stereo recording, there's a good chance that it's also coming from the mid channel as well, right? Whatever exists usually in the mids um, will kind of translate to the sides. For instance, if you have S's in a vocal, you throw a reverb on that vocal, you're going to get S's in the sides, right? So it's not always true the opposite way, but I will say that more than likely There's some issue there with the mid, but we've kind of tamped it down and I'm not hearing it as much. But that's just to go to show you that, especially on a stereo recording, we have the ability to kind of shape these sounds in really unique ways, right? And a normal EQ wouldn't be able to do this, because if I made this cut here with this a stereo band, right, stereo low shelf, we would have just taken all the low end away from the sound, right? We would have taken all the low mids away from the sound. We're only taking it from those side images, right? So this also becomes a really handy tool for uh, stereo recordings as well. The last thing that I'll show you is we have this kick here. And let me just loop this over so we have this pattern kind of looping. Here we have this kick. So if I put an EQ on this kick, and let's listen to the sides. There's a little bit of side information there in the kick. What I want to do is I'm going to come to a utility tool and I'm just going to essentially mono that. So now that we have that monoed all the way 100%, we don't even hear side information. There is no more side information in this kick, right? We listen to the mono or the mid channel, right? We can hear that full kick. Now, I wanted to show you this because even though now we have a mono signal, we have no side information, right? Now, if we were to pan this to a side left or right, we would start to actually get more of that sliding scale now. So what we can do is let's go to kick channel here. Let's move this out. 50%. Now let's listen to the side. And because the way that this routing is happening, we would probably have to put this EQ on the actual master. Right. Because effectively on the track itself, we're making it mono, so it's not really sensing that information as mono. And the panning is happening after the panning is happening after the effects, right? Not before it. But if we put it on the master now and we listen to the sides, we can hear more of that kick. We put that more in the center there. No side information. So that's really, really good to understand that as we move things around left and right, we start to push more of those frequencies into the sides. And like I said, generally with low end, I tend to not want to have that information in the sides, right? So if you're going to pan stuff out, I would generally recommend that you don't have a lot of stuff happening here, because we really want to make that frequency space intelligible for the low end instruments like the bass, the fundamentals of the vocals, any of our C3 instruments that are happening in the low mids of the track, right? So again, just a recommendation, not saying that you always got to do that, but it's just really nice to know that even though you have a mono sound, as soon as you start to move it left and right, we actually get more or less of that mid information. So again, it's like a sliding scale. The second that I move this away from 0, right? We have 0, nothing. Let's move it 1.5%. We have a little bit of information in the side, but most of it is in the mid, right? Move it 10%. A greater percentage of it is in the sides, but most of it is in the mids, right? So it's really important to get that into your head. And I think this is a pretty good example to kind of at least give you a basic foundation of the understanding of mid-side, because I think that's the primary basis that you want to be at of understanding what you're doing to your tracks as you move them left and right, as you add reverb, spatial processing, delays, anything like that, especially to stereo tracks, to stereo recordings, or mono sources that you move left and right. We can start to introduce more of that into the mid or the side. Now, again, be careful with your mid side EQs. You can do a lot of damage with them. So, again, you know, small, broad brushstrokes rather than these huge, sweeping, or really narrow kind of moves that you can do on an EQ, especially these more modern ones. Just be very careful because you can cause more issues. And that's why in the course, we tend not to talk about these more advanced tools until you have the basics of EQ down. But I thought I should make this video to kind of explain it. Now, there are other processes that we didn't walk through, such as mid-side compression, mid-side saturation, mid-side resonant suppression. There's a whole lot of different processes that we can do to the mid and the side channels. And there's also different times that those become more applicable than others, right? But I think this covers the basics. If you guys want me to make a video on mid-side compression, mid-side saturation, why we would use it, and when we would use it, just hit me up in the comments. Just say exactly the video that you would like me to make. Don't forget to like and subscribe to this video because every like and subscription really does help boost the algorithm and make sure other people get this information. Awesome, guys. I hope this was a good video, and I will see you in the next one. Peace.